Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of the Global Trade Show. I'm your host, Lawrence Christoffelsz. Today we've got a special interview with Simon Westaway, who's the CEO of the Australian Airports Association. Simon, great to meet you.
Oh, lovely to meet you as well, thank you.
Simon, let's talk about your role and the association itself.
Yeah, of course. So the Australian Airports Association's 40 years young, although it's probably evolved, particularly we had the privatisation of all the major airports and a lot of the regional airports, which occurred about 2 decades ago, and I guess the association continues to grow. So we have around 500 members currently. We have around 350 airports. There are actually more airports in Australia than the 350 we have, but a lot of them are those small airfields that are aero clubs and are non-commercial airports in many senses, where every airport that has a commercial landing, a fly-in fly-out arrangement for the mining sector or a freight arrangement and so forth, they're all members of us.
Wonderful. Well, I think most of us laymen probably see the big airports around the capital cities and so forth, and a few of the regional ones, but 350 is a big number that most of us are unaware of, really.
No, absolutely. So we've had airfields that go all the way back to pre-World War II in many cases, and what we're seeing is a bit of an evolution in the regional and rural space, if you like. So a lot of the regional and rural airfields are there as much for Royal Flying Doctor, air ambulance, defence. Many of the airfields have defence landings as one of their priorities as part of the protection of the nation and in their training, and even the stationary arrangements for their aircraft and various fleets from time to time. And obviously we have our big end of town, our Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, which are major airfields which take around about 95% of the international traffic currently to the country. And
I mean, as you've just mentioned, it's also the backbone economy of the FIFO with the mining sector, the resource sector. There's so many regional farming businesses and those type of things rely on those regional airports.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, what we're seeing is, you don't usually see airports just grow, but in terms of new airports, but we'll see in the Pilbara and that broader part of northwest WA, we're going to see about another 3 to 5 new airports over the next 3 years. So I'm actually going to be doing a tour in a few weeks' time of some of those facilities, the ones that are there and the ones that are up and coming. And that's basically for the fly-in, fly-out, the FIFO arrangements, mainly out of Perth, and obviously and hubbing through places like Port Hedland and Karratha, and then all going directly into those particular mining areas.
Great. I mean, I think, Simon, obviously with Import-Export TV, our platform, so many companies looking from overseas, the Australian geographical landscape, people don't appreciate how big it is as a country and how vital the infrastructure like airports play.
Yeah, so aviation is critical. Like pre the pandemic, the domestic aviation market in Australia, that's flying in and out and around Australia, was basically the 5th or 6th largest aviation sector in the world in terms of a domestic operation. So there's really only the States and some parts of Europe or India that are actually bigger. But so since that case, the domestic market's back to where it was, and internationally, we receive around about 37 to 40 million international trips a year. Now, a lot of those are Australians getting out of the country and looking at the world. Big connectivity in and out of Southeast Asia and North Asia. But what we're also seeing is a return of the tourists and the international students. So those numbers are still around about 15% off what they were pre-pandemic, but they ultimately will be back to par, and we've seen more visitors coming out of India, for example, than we did pre-pandemic, which is, I guess, a bit of a point of where the future of the industry is going. Freight's a key part of it at all, and a lot of the belly space is used for domestic services, and obviously there's an international freight component as well.
Yeah, great segue. I was going to ask you about that. Obviously, we've got people like IATA globally working with all the air cargo operators and so forth. That type of infrastructure, something like Western Sydney that's happening in a big way, and I know that having a few discussions with some of them, not recently, but when they first conceptualised it, it's going to have such a major impact on things like freight, logistics, a whole new airport. What do you see as that sort of the domino effect or the change that impact will have?
It's going to be pretty amazing. So we don't get a lot of new airports every day of the week, and obviously I've just alluded that we're actually developing airfields up our key mining, one of our key mining areas in Australia, to do with the fly-in, fly-out workforce, because it's very difficult to have families and households in that part of the world, but mining population can move in and out. Western Sydney International, WSI, is going to be a major development. So they should have first services occurring in late 2026 or mid to late 2026. Qantas have indicated that they'll have around at least 15 aircraft based at WSI in essence from day dot for domestic operations and as well as exploring the international potential. And Singapore Airlines have confirmed that they will be operating internationally into WSI. And we think within its first year, they're an important member of the AAA. We think that they could be obviously they'll be a top 10 airport by volumes and maybe top 6 or top 7 depending on where they get to in those initial years, but they'll certainly become one of the major airports. And Sydney Airport is obviously our leading airport in terms of size and scale, but Melbourne's doing pretty well. They're catching them, or they're in a bit of a race to remain who's going to be number one, but we've got big growth out of Brisbane and particularly Perth. I was at Perth Airport 2 weeks ago. It's incredible the amount of expansion that's going on there, and with Qantas with their Project Sunrise initiative in terms of how they want to use WA to the world from that side of the country. It's very impressive, and obviously they're only about 3 hours to Asia.
And that's what I think that WA springboard into that market, that whole ASEAN region is phenomenal, and it's great that they're finally sort of taking advantage of that to really push that out.
Yeah, I think so, and I think we had the big speed hub of the Black Swan event, which was COVID, and the industry had to reset, and so we've talked about this a lot broadly within the sector, but I think what we are seeing is the next 10 to 15 years for aviation in this part of the world is going to be significant growth. IATA are talking about a compound growth of international travel between 6 and 7%, I believe, but I think internationally, in terms of traffic in and out of Australia, we could have double digits in front of it for most compound for the next 10 years. Off the back of a lot of Aussies will continue to travel. We've got that obviously diverse population, big connectivity to some of the countries, China, India, Singapore, Malaysia. We're developing more open sky arrangements. We currently have 7, in essence moving to 10 in 2026. That's the liberalised skies for those markets like your China's, US and so forth is seeing a lot more capacity come on board. So, we're becoming a very, very fast growing aviation market, and from a small population which is very wealthy and diverse and outward looking in many cases, I think there's some big opportunities here.
Yeah, fantastic. I know from a maritime perspective, when we look at the cargo side, there's always discussion around productivity. Is that something that, from an Australian airport's perspective, where do we sit? Are we strong in the productivity? I don't know the answer to that. So,
well, I probably don't know the exact answer in terms of data around it. We are pretty productive, although obviously there's some hindrances around the productivity. So Sydney Airport, which is obviously our preeminent gateway on size and scale, they have a productivity hindrance, and that's they have a curfew. So 2,300 hours, 11 p.m. each evening until 6 a.m. each morning. There's a micro number of dispensations allowed for freight and some other allowances, but basically the airport's closed for flying for those 7 hours of the day, the 24-hour day, where Melbourne's a 24/7, as is Brisbane, and WSI will be a 24/7 airport. But where you have curfews around the country, and there's a few of them, that does restrict productivity. We've seen some really good reforms recently. So the Commonwealth government put through, with the support of the coalition, changes at Sydney Airport with this slot management system. At one level it didn't sound a lot, but actually there was big reform. We'll see a lot more flexibility in the way that the slots will work. So there's flexibility around storms and times of impact that affects regular services. So that's a good productivity change there.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Simon. So I wanted to ask you about the association's initiatives. What do you typically do throughout the year? Obviously you're expanding quite rapidly, and it sounds like you've got great overseas engagement as well. So are there some things coming up in 2025?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've sort of got a three-pronged process, I suppose, or approach. We've got very much driven by policy and advocacy, and our focus in on Canberra, the Canberra bubble, and now we try to pop it or prick it from time to time. So we're very proactive in that space. We have a Canberra-based HQ. I move between Canberra and some of the other capitals, and I'm a Melbourne-based person, but I spend the majority of my time in Canberra and have a long pedigree in that part of the world. We do a lot with our members, so we have a 500 membership member body, and we do a lot of work with our members around events, but pointed policy committees and that evolution in that. And we have obviously airports and corporate members, and we're continuing to grow our corporate side of the business, and so we're really leaning into areas like security screening, airspace management, thinking about relationships with the likes of Home Affairs and so forth, how we can have a broader relationship. And I guess the third area for us is our voice. Well, obviously we're a key succinct voice for the airport sector, but how we can play a bigger role around tourism, how we can play a bigger role in some of the other parts of whether you call it the travel economy or the visitor economy, and that a broader impact. We're in itself as an airport sector, And what comes in and out, we are about $105 billion, or around about a 5% contributor to the national economy. So we've got scope and scale now, both in the capital city as well as a regional centre and smaller rural setting.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, that leads me to a question that sort of follows on from that. Now, they've just had a recent announcement about the Qatar Virgin buy-in. What's the view on that? How are you looking forward to that?
Oh, look, we're very positive. We're very positive about it. We push very strongly in our own way. So it's a great announcement for competition and for consumers, and importantly, it really just reinforces our philosophic approach around more open skies, more liberal arrangements in place. So there's a desperate need for more flight capacity in and out of Australia. It's a long swim to many other parts of the world, and we rely on aviation a lot. And I guess we have to show the intent in terms of open arrangements, where it's one thing to be not protectionist, but to obviously support our local sector. But it's important that we allow good competition to come online. So for Qatar partnership, the 5-year arrangement, we're a very strong supporter. We put in a lot of submissions around it. We've been very public about it. So we're obviously very pleased by the outcome. We're also very pleased to see a strong Qantas. Obviously they've had their results this week, which I think that would be very pleasing to their shareholders. There's always a bit of oil and water with airports and airlines, but the reality is one needs the other. And it's important that we have a strong, sustainable base for the future. And I think we've got that with both Qantas and Virgin Australia. We have very strong domestic airlines, which I think provides that bedrock, which is important around what the future looks like. Yeah,
thanks, Simon. And one of my last questions, as a Melburnian myself, we talked about Perth. I was there also a few weeks ago. The way that it's booming there, the growth in that airport is phenomenal. Something like the Melbourne Airport Rail, I know we're almost at election time, even though I haven't announced it yet. Is that something that you guys get involved with? Do you have input, sort of voice on that?
Yeah, so the voice sticks in behind Melbourne Airport, who can run the advocacy on that very comfortably themselves. But that said, I think it's really important that we've seen some further policy intent this week and more money put on the table. I think ultimately it's about what the delivery will look like in the coming years. I think it's fairly obvious that we need a solution to come sooner rather than later. I get there'll be a pretty significant time frame around it, but Melbourne Airport, under their own planning model and all the federal government planning arrangements, show that airport doubling in its scale around about 2040, and the way the growth rates are going, we'll see very, very strong traffic volumes, well above what they're doing now. They do around 37 million visits a year, as I understand, or trips through the airport now. It could quite comfortably double by around that 2040 mark, but the way the growth's looking, you're going to see a lot more people fly that airport compound each and every year moving forward. They're building for the future now with some of their announcements around back end, the way they do their baggage arrangements, the new road arrangements, the new terminal arrangements they're putting in place, and so they're an airport with a future-facing approach, and it does require a rail link. And obviously this week's announcements, yes, there's elections in the air, but it's not for us to comment about it, other than it's good to see that there's some ongoing intent to try to find the solution. And obviously part of that solution is having the dollars on the table.
Yeah. Thanks, Simon. I know I said that was the last question, but I just thought of another one, if I can throw this at you. Sustainability. I mean, it's a big push. The aviation sector, I know, especially in Europe and other markets, it's a real challenge that airports and airlines have to address. There's a whole range of new fuels and all those type of things. Is that a big agenda for the association?
Yeah, it's a big agenda now. It can increasingly become so. I think it's going to be a matter of walking before we can run, and working through what's possible and what's probable and what is probably not possible. But we have opportunities in this country to develop our own future fuel sector, working closely with the refineries that remain, and how we can transition, or airlines and therefore airports work in that transition. So the role of airports is going to be pretty significant around this in terms of those new fuels. There's also, interestingly, we don't get a lot of discussion around this at the moment, but we are going to see a transition in the regional space, rural space, moving towards more electric aircraft, which we're still not quite there yet, but it's post Jetsons. We will definitely get there in terms of, and it'll quite frankly, as someone from a regional Australian background, it's going to be really exciting to revisit a smaller aircraft type that can run fully electric, recharge at airports. It's going to rebirth a number of the regional ports, and it'll bring obviously the cost of doing that down. So I'm really excited about that, and that may not be that far away in terms of the initial electric aircraft hitting the market here in Australia. The challenge is we're going through a regional market shake-up. Rex Airlines is in administration. It was a pretty cataclysmic fail of that airline, and they'll obviously work through those changes, and that will mean changes in those communities that they currently serve. So we'll have to see how the market response, and obviously the federal government have got a big role at the moment in how they want to try to see that reshape. But I think we're seeing electric aviation on the horizon, and that's not about your flights from Sydney to Delhi or Melbourne, Singapore and the like. This is all about connecting, say, a Melbourne or a Sydney into central New South Wales or to Mildura, or even some of our smaller ports, your Ballarats, Bendigos out of Melbourne and things of that nature, and bring markets that perhaps we've gone once back into the equation and moving people efficiently and cost effectively around.
Yeah, lovely. I think I was lucky enough to see some prototype freighters that were electric as well, and they picked up 20-foot containers, and even one of them was sort of unmanned, like a drone essentially.
Oh, it's exciting. And what's really exciting is for airports, they're going to transition to be energy hubs in their own way. And we're not the only sector that will be that. You think about caravan parks, for example, a little bit off piste, that could actually probably do a bit more work in this space and become more energy centres for the hordes of people that still caravan and drive around their mobile campers around the country. So, part of the energy transition, airports are actually really well placed. The full replacement of avgas is a significant challenge. It is the most efficient way to move aircraft long distances most cost effectively. Yes, it has an impact on carbon emissions. Australia's a long way away from the rest of the world, and the changes in the EU around the taxing arrangements will significantly affect us, and it's often not discussed. We as a sector will start talking about it a bit more, because we have at least 1 million visitors a year come out of Central, Northern and Eastern Europe, and they'll come into this country in the coming years with a new tax arrangement, and we'll have to see if that really does impact demand or not. And hikes in ticket prices obviously at some point have an impact in terms of elasticity. So.
Yeah. Well, I'd love to really dive down that rabbit hole with you in another episode and talk about the ESG in aviation, because that could be, as you say, there's a lot more to really uncover and discuss around that.
Oh, absolutely, and I think on the trade side, as you say, there's some opportunities there to move our great freight opportunities and get them in and out of the country in more seamless, effective ways. So, really love to have a chat to you about that at some point.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you for taking the time today. I know how busy you are. Appreciate sharing your insights about AAA and what you guys are doing in 2025, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Yeah, thank you. All the best.
Thanks, Simon. Cheers.
Thanks.